The Assyrian Empire rose from the plains of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers gave life to early civilization. But where others built with trade or culture, the Assyrians built with fear. Their rulers understood that terror was more powerful than swords. By the 9th century BCE, kings like Ashurnasirpal II turned cruelty into a system of governance. To disobey Assyria was not merely to risk defeat, it was to invite horrors carved into the flesh of your people. Punishment was both spectacle and lesson. The Assyrians made torture public. Captured rebels were not hidden away in dungeons, but displayed before their own towns. The empire wanted every villager, soldier, and child to see what rebellion cost. Terror was as essential as taxes. One of the most infamous practices was flaying. Prisoners were stripped of their garments and tied to poles in open squares. Sharp knives tore into their skin, peeling it away like a farmer peeling bark from a tree. This was not swift execution. It was deliberate mutilation. Flayed skins were nailed to the walls of conquered cities. They fluttered like banners in the desert wind, grim reminders of Assyrian power. Inscriptions from the time boast proudly of these acts, as if cruelty were as glorious as victory itself. The kings themselves often watched. Ashurnasirpal II wrote of the satisfaction of seeing rebels writhe beneath his knives. For him, torture was not only a punishment, but also an art form, a demonstration of his control over both life and death. Yet flaying was only one tool in their arsenal. Burning was another. Captured leaders were bound and thrown into raging fires, their screams echoing through temple courtyards. Sometimes they were roasted alive on spits, as though reduced to animals. These fiery executions carried symbolic weight. Fire was a divine element, associated with the gods. To burn a man alive was to condemn his soul as well as his body, denying him the dignity of burial. It was punishment that reached beyond death. Impalement may have been the most feared of all. Wooden stakes were sharpened and driven through the bodies of rebels. Sometimes the stake pierced the torso, other times it was forced up through the anus or chest, leaving the victim writhing for hours, even days. The impaled were left standing along the roads leading to Assyrian cities. Travelers could not enter Nineveh or Ashur without passing rows of agonized bodies. It was architecture made of human suffering, a living wall of warning. These methods were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate state policy. Assyrian kings ordered their deeds inscribed on stone reliefs and clay tablets. They wanted history itself to carry the memory of their terror. The cruelty was immortalized in art. The empire's military campaigns were designed not only to conquer, but to humiliate. Towns that resisted were destroyed. Survivors were tortured before their families. Entire populations were deported, forced to march hundreds of miles as living testaments to Assyrian dominance. One chilling scene appears in palace carvings, lines of prisoners with ropes through their lips, strung together like animals on a leash. Each step tore at their flesh. The Assyrian message was clear: your body is ours, your pain belongs to us. Children were not spared from these displays. Some were forced to watch their parents flayed or impaled, others were killed before their parents' eyes. The Assyrians knew that fear carried deeper scars when planted in memory as well as flesh. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical. Tales of Assyrian cruelty spread faster than their armies. Villages often surrendered without resistance, preferring submission to the horrors that awaited those who defied the empire's will. Even religion was entwined with torture. Kings claimed that their violence was commanded by the gods. Ashur, the chief deity, was invoked to justify rivers of blood. To resist Assyria was to resist heaven itself, and divine wrath was made manifest in human agony. Inside the empire, these acts reinforced loyalty. Nobles, governors, and generals knew what fate awaited them if they wavered. The throne was not guarded by soldiers alone, but by the memory of burning flesh and screaming captives. Despite the savagery, the Assyrians also saw themselves as bringers of order. To them, torture was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a tool to forge stability. A world ruled by fear was, in their eyes, a world under control. Foreign envoys who visited Assyria carried tales back to their homelands. The reputation of Assyrian torture became a weapon that extended beyond borders. Fear alone conquered cities long before soldiers arrived. The cruelty even seeped into daily life. Markets and public squares sometimes stood beside places of execution. For citizens, brutality was not distant. It was woven into the rhythm of ordinary existence. Terror was as much a civic institution as law or taxation. Archaeological finds confirm these horrors. Reliefs carved into palace walls at Nimrud and Nineveh depict prisoners being flayed, tongues torn out, and bodies impaled. The images are precise, as though the artists themselves were eyewitnesses. The Assyrians recorded their conquests in chilling detail. Kings boasted of the thousands they slaughtered, the cities they burned, the captives they tortured. Their annals read less like history and more like catalogues of cruelty. And yet, within this brutality, the empire thrived. Roads were built, trade flourished, and magnificent palaces rose. All of it stood upon foundations soaked in blood. Progress was inseparable from pain. By the time the Assyrian Empire reached its peak, its name alone was enough to freeze hearts. The empire's cruelty was not a secret shame, but a proud banner. Torture was not hidden in shadows, but carved into stone to last for eternity. The Assyrian Empire thrived not only because of its armies, but because of the machinery of fear it created. Torture was not random violence. It was organized, rehearsed, and carried out with precision, like a state-sponsored ritual. Every conquest began with a show of force. When an Assyrian army arrived at city walls, they offered a choice: surrender or suffer. If surrender came, tribute and loyalty were extracted. If resistance was chosen, the people became props in a theater of horror. Siege warfare often ended with deliberate massacres. After walls crumbled, soldiers dragged rebels into squares. The executions were staged in front of entire populations. Some were beheaded swiftly, but the leaders faced far worse: tortures designed to linger in memory. One of the most chilling methods was tongue removal. Captives who spoke against the king had their tongues ripped out with iron hooks. They were then paraded, blood spilling from their mouths, living reminders of what happened to those who dared to speak defiance. Others suffered mutilation of hands, ears, or noses. The Assyrians believed disfigurement was a punishment worse than death. A man without a nose or ears was forever marked as an enemy who had been broken, carrying the scars through the rest of his days. The empire also mastered deportation as a tool of terror. Entire populations were shackled and forced to march to distant lands. Families were separated, elders left to die, and children sold into slavery. The suffering of the journey itself became part of the punishment. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to torture. Manuals and traditions passed through generations ensured that brutality was efficient. Flaying, burning, and impalement were perfected to prolong agony without immediate death, turning pain into spectacle. Palaces were decorated with reliefs that celebrated cruelty. Walls of Nimrud showed prisoners flayed alive, tongues pulled, and captives on stakes. These were not warnings for enemies alone. They reminded citizens and officials that the king's authority came from terror. The Assyrians also used humiliation as a weapon. Captured kings were paraded through Nineveh, wearing chains and dog collars. Some were forced to pull the Assyrian king's chariot like beasts. The purpose was not only physical pain, but the destruction of pride. Burning continued to play a central role in punishment. Some rebels were locked inside wooden cages and set ablaze, their screams echoing as flames consumed them. Others were bound to pyres before temples, sacrificed as living offerings to Assur, the chief god. Impalement, however, remained the empire's signature cruelty. Stakes lined the roads into major cities. Sometimes captives were impaled alive and left for days. Other times, corpses were mounted in rows, turning highways into processions of death. There are accounts of Assyrian kings boasting of impaling hundreds at once. One inscription claims that after conquering a city, the king impaled 3,000 of its warriors along the walls. These numbers may be exaggerated, but the terror they spread was real. Children again were often made to watch. The Assyrians understood that the trauma of seeing parents tortured was more effective than killing children outright. Fear embedded in young minds grew into submission that lasted generations. Psychological torture extended beyond families, rebels were forced to carry their comrades' heads, sometimes even eat their flesh. Whether these accounts were propaganda or reality, the intention was clear: to strip people of humanity itself. The cruelty was not hidden in shame. It was displayed in inscriptions carved by scribes. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III bragged about their deeds. Their writings celebrated the rivers of blood, the walls of skin, and the forests of stakes. Such inscriptions were sent across the empire as propaganda. Governors read them aloud to their subjects. Messages carved in stone outlived kings, ensuring that even future generations trembled at the thought of Assyrian wrath. Inside the empire, loyalty was sustained through fear as much as through reward. Officials who betrayed their king were executed with the same tortures used on enemies. Assyrian rulers trusted terror more than trust itself. The empire's cruelty was not only about punishment, but control. By spreading fear before armies arrived, they often avoided resistance entirely. Villages surrendered tribute rather than risk the fate they had heard whispered in horror. Religious justification strengthened the brutality. Priests proclaimed that torture was divine will, commanded by the gods to keep order. Kings presented themselves as chosen instruments of Assur, enforcers of divine justice through pain. The duality was striking. The same empire that built aqueducts, libraries, and palaces also perfected systems of torment. Civilization and savagery existed side by side, each feeding the other. The splendor of Nineveh glittered over foundations of blood. In time, cruelty became tradition. Successive kings repeated the same acts, as if brutality itself was the throne's inheritance. To rule Assyria was to torture. To torture was to prove worthiness of kingship. Violence was woven into identity. Fear even shaped diplomacy. Foreign envoys visiting the Assyrian court passed through streets lined with mutilated captives. The message was clear before negotiations began. Resistance was hopeless, mercy impossible. For the Assyrians, terror was not madness but strategy. It built an empire that stretched from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Yet beneath the fear lay a dangerous seed: resentment. The cruelty that secured their power also planted the desire for revenge among their enemies. By the height of their power, the Assyrians had made torture a science, a spectacle, and a sacred duty. The machinery of fear kept millions in submission, but it also ensured that when the empire faltered, its enemies would show no mercy in return. The Assyrian Empire reached its height in the 7th century BCE, stretching across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even into Egypt. From Nineveh, the capital, kings ruled with iron and fire. Yet beneath the grandeur lay cracks formed by centuries of cruelty. For generations, the Assyrians had relied on terror to hold their empire together. Flaying, burning, and impalement had kept enemies submissive. But fear, while powerful, could not create loyalty. Resentment spread like poison across the lands they ruled. The subject peoples, Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and others, waited for weakness. They remembered the sight of their fathers impaled, their mothers burned, their brothers mutilated. Every stake planted in Assyrian soil also planted a seed of vengeance. Inside Assyria itself, brutality bred exhaustion. Nobles lived under constant fear of royal punishment. Generals knew that failure meant mutilation. Even ordinary citizens could not escape the shadow of horror. The empire had no refuge from its own violence. Assyrian kings remained blind to this decay. They continued to boast of their cruelty, inscribing tales of rivers of blood and mountains of corpses. They believed fear alone was enough to preserve eternity. But eternity was already slipping away. The turning point came with the reign of Ashurnasirpal, the last great Assyrian king. His campaigns extended the empire to its widest reach, but they also overextended its strength. Revolts multiplied as subjects sought freedom from Assyrian terror. Coalitions formed in secret. The Babylonians, long humiliated by Assyrian rule, allied with the Medes, a rising power from the east. Together, they forged a pact fueled not by politics alone, but by the shared memory of Assyrian cruelty. As rebellions spread, the Assyrians answered with their usual tools. Rebels were flayed in marketplaces, impaled outside city gates, and burned alive before temples. But instead of quelling resistance, these acts only hardened resolve. The cycle of violence fed upon itself. The empire's machinery of fear began to fail. Where once villages surrendered at the whisper of Assyrian approach, now they fought with desperation. Better to die in battle than suffer the stake. Fear had lost its edge. By 612 BCE, the coalition marched on Nineveh itself. The great city, filled with palaces decorated with scenes of torture, became the target of vengeance. The armies of Babylon and Media encircled it, determined to erase Assyria from history. The siege was brutal. For months the attackers battered walls, cut off supplies, and waited for weakness. Inside, the citizens of Nineveh, once accustomed to watching the suffering of others, now felt terror closing in upon themselves. When the walls finally fell, the vengeance of centuries poured into the streets. The conquerors showed no mercy. Palaces were looted, temples burned, and Assyrian nobles slaughtered. The empire that had thrived on cruelty was consumed by it. Accounts claim that captured Assyrians were tortured in the same ways they had once tortured others. Flaying knives carved their skins, stakes pierced their bodies, and fires consumed their leaders. The tools of terror turned against their masters. Nineveh, once the jewel of Mesopotamia, was reduced to ashes. The great library of Ashurnasirpal, filled with tablets of history and law, was buried in ruins. Assyrian palaces, decorated with reliefs of mutilation, collapsed into dust and silence. For the subject peoples, the fall was not simply political, it was cosmic justice. Generations had lived under the shadow of Assyrian horror. Now, they believed, the gods themselves had delivered judgment. The empire of torture was no more. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered the ruins of Assyria. The reliefs of flaying, burning, and impalement survived in stone, testifying to the brutality once celebrated as glory. History remembered what the empire itself had boasted of. The Assyrians had believed fear would last forever. Yet their cruelty had built an empire without friends, allies, or love. When enemies struck, no one came to Assyria's aid. Their terror isolated them, ensuring their destruction. The fall of Assyria became a lesson for future empires. Power built on cruelty may rise high, but it cannot endure. Fear can control for a time, but it cannot bind hearts. Sooner or later, terror consumes its own masters. In the end, the Assyrian Empire left behind two legacies. One was its achievements, roads, palaces, libraries, and military innovations. The other was its brutality, methods of torture that shocked even later civilizations. Both remain etched in human history. The ruins of Nineveh still whisper this paradox. Among broken walls and shattered statues, archaeologists find both the brilliance of empire and the darkness of cruelty. The stones speak of progress carved in blood, of civilization balanced on stakes. Thus ended the Assyrian reign of terror. Their empire collapsed beneath the weight of its own savagery, proving that even the mightiest throne cannot stand forever when it rests upon human suffering.